Thank you everyone for joining us for this roundtable discussion on teaching Asian American Studies at CUNY for the Harvard Asian American Policy Review. My name is Sonia Munshi, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Asian American Asian Research Institute at CUNY, and I also teach Asian American Studies at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. AARI organized this roundtable to offer a space for CUNY faculty to reflect on teaching Asian American Studies at CUNY, draw connections between the classroom and community, and discuss some of our hopes and visions for the future of this field and our collective work. Our discussion today is intentionally grounded in our local context. We all teach in New York City, the home of one of the biggest and most diverse Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in the United States, made up of groups that have long histories in the United States, like the Chinese, Indian, Filipino, and Korean communities, newer communities to the United States, for example, Nepali, Burmese, and Tibetan communities, refugees such as Vietnamese and Cambodian communities, and diasporic populations whose ancestors first migrated to places in the Caribbean and Latin America before coming to the United States. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are also the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in New York City, making up almost 18% of the city's population. At CUNY, which is a public institution made up of 25 campuses throughout New York City, we see a reflection of this community growth with an increase to almost over 20% of students who identify as Asian. CUNY has a long history of efforts that engage Asian American studies and communities, and while these activities have rarely been sustained over time or institutionalized, CUNY has been the home to vibrant student activism and organizing, collaborative networks built of scholars and practitioners, and creative interventions made to support Asian American and Pacific Islanders students, staff, and faculty across the university. So our roundtable today includes faculty members who bring Asian American studies into their work at CUNY, either through teaching specific Asian American studies courses, weaving in Asian American studies content into other curriculum, and or through other programs and projects on their campus. And so I'm really delighted to be hosting this conversation with all of you. And I'm going to open up the conversation by asking each one of you to share a little bit about your work. So if you could introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, and the campus you work at. And then if you want to say anything about your relationship to Asian American Studies at CUNY, courses that you teach, or any projects that you work on, so that we can know a little bit about where you're coming from. Share your introduction. And then the first question for you is, during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen an increased visibility of Asian Americans, primarily through the lens of anti-Asian violence. How has this hypervisibility affected your Asian American Studies pedagogies? So for example, how you teach, what you teach, or why you teach, and tell us a little bit about some of your reflections over the last few years. So we'll open it up with Anita.
Thank you, Sonia. My name is Anita Baksh. My pronouns are she, her, and I am professor of English at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens, New York. The increase of anti-Asian violence across the nation, and in New York City in particular, has definitely shaped my work in Asian American Studies in the classroom and beyond. I incorporate Asian American literature in most courses that I teach, including literature, composition, liberal arts, and women's studies. Because I teach in a large department at a community college, I primarily teach composition, and Asian American literature is not offered every semester. We do have a new ethnic studies program, so hopefully that will increase how much the course and related courses are taught. My approach to teaching Asian American literature follows a social justice framework in the sense that I focus on the history of Asian American immigration, exclusion, and most recently, immigrant communities in New York City. Topics include Japanese internment, Islamophobia, Cambodian and Indo-Korean communities in New York City. And my pedagogy is also informed, as Sonia mentioned, in the fact that I teach at an urban community college in New York City, and in particularly Queens, New York. So I contextualize recent iterations of anti-Asian hate and larger histories of xenophobia, Orientalism, and discrimination. One of the ways I've done this is by analyzing with students the work of Red Canary Song, the grassroots collective of Asian and migrant sex workers and allies. We discussed their statement on the shooting at the Gold Massage Spa in Atlanta in 2021. The statement contextualizes the shootings in the history of Asian invisibility, imperialism, and Orientalism. And at the same time, it discusses the consequences of more policing that affects other communities of color. Sadly, the hypervisibility of Asian Americans as a result of violence during the pandemic brought together various entities across our campus to raise awareness and promote dialogue around this issue, and contributed to making the efforts of faculty and staff around Asian American studies more visible. This is sad because before the pandemic, these efforts on campus were largely led by faculty and staff who volunteered to plan the AAPI May celebration and taught Asian American studies material in their courses. For example, the president of the college put out a statement condemning anti-Asian hate, and Student Life approached the AAPI committee to organize programs around anti-Asian hate. Together, we planned 2 town halls that educated students, faculty, and staff about the history of Asian discrimination in the US, provided information about the campus and community resources for students, and created spaces for dialogue around issues of discrimination, stereotypes, and cross-cultural encounters. In addition, as the leader of the AAPI committee in 2021, I invited the New York City Commissioner of Human Rights, Carmelyn Morales, to speak about efforts the New York City government was taking to combat anti-Asian hate, including supporting the art of Amanda Fing Bodhi Pakia and her I Still Believe in Our City public art series that featured brave AAPI figures standing up against anti-Asian violence. So in the next question, I'll talk a little bit more about how my work in the classroom and outside of the classroom engage in these efforts.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Kyungah Hong, she, her pronouns, and I'm an English and Asian American Studies professor at Queens College, CUNY in Flushing, New York. I'm also the director and lead PI of the newly funded Queens College Anapisi project, or QCAP, which is a USDOE funded project to support the to provide academic support, mental health support, and community engagement opportunities for our diverse AAPI students on campus. So my responses to the first question are a bit more general. I hope that's okay. But I would say, the pandemic and everything that's happened since the pandemic has actually shifted my pedagogies a lot in really, I hope, productive, generative ways. Though I don't know that I would necessarily say it's because of the hyper visibility aspect of that. I think as a scholar and teacher of Asian American literature and culture, my approach, I've always approached learning and critique as acts of care and acts of love. And that's something I've always tried to model with my students. But I think teaching during a time of crisis, at a time, the intersections of multiple crises, I should say, I've really leaned into that. So for me, really prioritizing building class communities and spaces that are warm, welcoming, inclusive, supportive, safe in as much as that's possible, and classrooms and spaces that really center the needs of our most vulnerable students, to really show them that I see them and their complex identities and lived experiences. And I think that actually really is central to the work of Asian American Studies. So I don't see that as something that's not connected to this, right? And the other thing I wanted to say briefly here, which maybe is sort of sidestepping the question, is I wanted to say that another thing I want to acknowledge is that I think Asians and Asian Americans are increasingly visible and on the minds of our students in other ways too that aren't just framed as hate or violence. Like, for example, in pop culture, and this is, you see my bias as a literary and cultural critic. And so I was actually talking to Linta the other day. We were chatting about how we don't really mind when students show up in our Asian American Studies classes because they love anime or K-pop or K-dramas. That actually, whatever their entry points may be, that I personally think it's really great when they're able to start making connections and asking questions via things that they already love and are passionate about, that can be a real asset in the classroom, right? And so the other thing I want to say about my pedagogies my Asian American Studies pedagogies is that I explicitly make individual and collective joy and pleasure and meaning making primary learning goals in my classes. And I list them as such on my syllabi, right? I actually name those as one of our main goals. And I think since the pandemic, I've made this even more of a priority in my classes. The world is a lot right now. Our students and us as instructors, we're going through so much. And I really believe that joy and pleasure are crucial and critical to Asian American Studies pedagogies, not to the exclusion of other stuff, but working in conjunction with all our other sort of goals, approaches, and methods.
Thank you. Marcia?
Yeah, thanks. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Marcia Liu. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am at Hunter College on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I'm also the mental health specialist for the Hunter College and Appeasy project. About 34% of Hunter identifies as being of Asian or Pacific Islander descent, which very much informs my Asian American Studies teaching, because usually out of 25 students, 20 of them do identify as being part of the Asian American community, which is it's such a unique experience. They're also, I think of them as being very anti-model minority in that they aren't given a lot of these accolades, and they don't get a lot of their stories kind of given the press that oftentimes media picks up on, in terms of these super wealthy, super high achieving, going to Harvard and flooding UCLA kind of stories about Asian Americans. These are commuter students. Their parents or themselves are first generation immigrants. They're working class. They are working 3 different jobs, and education is just one of like several priorities for them. Bearing all of that in mind, this is usually also, because Asian American Studies is a full department at Hunter, this is usually one of several electives they're taking, and they kind of wandered into the class because it fits with their work schedule, and they found it maybe marginally interesting in terms of the title. So people are coming with a lot of variable previous access or previous knowledge about Asian American Studies issues. And I really liked what you said, Caroline, around like various different entry points and kind of using that and capitalizing on it. I think about post-pandemic, during pandemic that we're in, it's been interesting to try and acknowledge the hypervisibility of Asian Americans in some ways, especially East Asians and Southeast Asians in some ways, with the various narratives related to COVID. As well as feeling like those stories oftentimes aren't being told by the people who are experiencing them. So having kind of these narratives talked about, people are telling you about your experience without you really having a lot of time to process, like, how do I feel about that? Do I feel like that's been my experience or not? Is something that I'm thinking about when we're talking about Asian American communities, especially specific to New York City in the classroom. Another thing I've been really trying to note also is around linking this wave of anti-Asian violence to all the different waves prior, and especially thinking about New York City, thinking about post 9/11 terrorism in terms of South Asian Americans being really surveilled and experiencing a lot of specific xenophobia that hadn't really been named before, but had been existing for 100 years. Just trying to lay out a framework for how we can understand this moment as connected to all these other moments and histories of xenophobia. And then my last point was around, I teach a theories and methods for researching Asian American, research methods course focusing on Asian Americans in New York. And as much as I can, there's not a lot written about educating about pedagogical interventions within Asian American Studies. I think a lot of times I'm bringing in news stories, I'm bringing in tweets, I'm bringing in social media, I'm bringing in TikToks, whatever is possible, because I feel like as so much as we can make this kind of an accessible kind of like the matter, the content being really kind of all around us in our daily lives, it feels like this is much more of like a lived experience rather than something you're reading about in a book that was published 30 years ago about what Asian American cultural values are. So that's also something I've been thinking about too.
Linta?
Hi, thanks Sonia for inviting all of us. So I'm Linta Varghese, and I'm an assistant professor of Asian and Asian American Studies at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. My line is actually in the Department for Ethnic Studies. So we are a multi-field department. We have Africana and African American Studies, Latin American, Latinx Studies, and just like a general ethnic studies that's often taught in a very comparative framework. I'm also the coordinator for a collaborative and a PZ grant. So that's the Department of Education Minority Serving Institution grant that focuses on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And the collaboration is with Hunter College. So we actually work a lot with Marcia and folks over at Hunter. I was thinking about this. Oh, I'm sorry. My pronouns are she, they. So I was thinking about this question and about how the hypervisibility on our campus, the hypervisibility of Asian Americans on a campus that's mostly not Asian American, and how that kind of looks and impacts our teaching and our campus culture also. So I think that teaching Asian American Studies to mainly Black and Latinx students means that I don't have to, but my approach is to make a lot of connections and talk about Asian American racialization and history in a very relational way. So I think I have a lot of thoughts, sorry, but one of the other things that I do want to highlight is that, like a lot of CUNY campuses, we have a lot of first-generation college students. We also have a lot of students who a lot of their life wasn't in the United States, so they haven't come completely through the US education system. So some of the points of reference that I might use in another setting, they just don't really work when students perhaps just finished high school and came to a community college in New York City in particular. So I think that the visibility of Asian Americans during this moment, East Asian Americans in particular, it seems like a new thing. And like a few other folks have said already, I do make these connections to, kind of past events, to like what's happening around the globe. But in this moment, I think connections around policing and how we address this, and how anti-Asian violence has to be addressed within the context of like the rest of our student body, are points that I try to highlight. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Diana.
Hi, I'm Diana Pan, and I am an associate professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. I'm also the director of American Studies. So Brooklyn College has actually grown significantly in terms of student population, but specifically for our Asian American students. When I first started 10 years ago, Asian American students were less than the teens, and currently they're over 23% of the student body. And our students may look a little different in profile, right? It really reflects the population of Brooklyn. Our Asian American students are quite diasporic in terms of their compositions. We have a lot of Indo-Caribbean students. We have a lot of South Asian and Muslim students. And so, but what we're also seeing is that as the borough itself grows, right, as Sunset Park grows, as Borough Park grows, we see more and more East Asian students as well, reflecting the growth and changing demographics of Brooklyn. So it is a really exciting, unique space to be in and kind of watch our student population morph. By the same token, unlike you all, we don't have an Asian American Studies curriculum. So we don't, it's something that's sorely lacking. And I know it's something that the college has pushed for, or individual faculty and staff have been pushing for over the last 30 plus years, right? And so I recently, pre-pandemic in 2018, the most recent iteration of this push came before the COVID-19 pandemic, and I happened to be a part of that group. We didn't have a lot of administrative support, but what happened right at post 2020 is there's been a lot more visibility and interest on the part of the administration. And there's been a lot more support with regard to that. There was a speak out after the Atlanta squash shootings in spring of 21. We were, as a group of faculty and staff, able to reinvigorate the Asian American Faculty and Staff Association in trying to really make more visible the issues that were pertinent to our Asian American students. Because even though we saw in the news a hypervisibility of what was happening to Asian American communities, I'm not sure that was resonating on a large scale on my campus. And so, so these are the efforts that have been made. Throughout this course, there have been, 3 Asian American Studies classes that have been developed at Brooklyn College, and they're currently nested within American Studies. There are more such courses that are being developed. Most recently, a colleague in the Caribbean Studies department developed an Asia and the Caribbean course, right, really highlighting the diaspora and the diversity within the diaspora. As to how I've been teaching Asian American Studies, Asian American Studies is new, right? The curriculum is new. We have 3 new classes on the books this academic school year. So this is all very fresh, but I'm a sociologist of race. And so I've been incorporating various intersecting Asian American experiences into my courses. And I teach theory and I teach research methods, right? And so doing, I use exemplars, I use examples that span the population of Brooklyn College students. So not just focusing on Asian Americans, but like the way that Linta had described earlier, really focusing on the intersections, right? And the interconnections between Latinx, Black, Asian American communities, and also more so, really trying to make visible the experiences of Indigenous communities, right? Because that's something we need to, think about holistically as race scholars, as, who's visible, who's invisible, and why that is as a part of the larger racisms canon, because that's the other thing I've also been pushing in my classes since 2021, is how racisms and our structures affect different groups differently, right? So what we've currently been learning about structural racism omits the experiences of Asian Americans and Indigenous Americans, right? So how do we think about racisms as intersectional, and how do we think of them as reflecting these larger white supremacist structures? So I think that's all I'll say here.
Great. Thank you all so much. I mean, I think I appreciated all the different ways that you took this question or sidestepped the question or reinterpreted it, because I think that there is a lot, and I think that there's a lot coming out through your responses about, what do we make of like our contemporary in this moment Asian American practice, and like what are the pedagogical approaches? So it's, as we think about what we're doing in the classroom, the content, of course, is part of what we're thinking about in terms of how we develop our curriculum. And as some of you are noting, who are the students in the room, who are the students at the institution, really helps to shape what we're focusing on in terms of which Asian American communities are centered on our syllabi, and how we think about Asian American communities in relationship to other racial and ethnic groups or other histories. So how do we think about the history of migration of Asian Americans and the histories of settler colonialism? And those kinds of relationships have to be really critical to our practice. But then also, like, I really appreciated some of the notes that you shared about what else we're bringing into the classroom, what are the entry points, the sources of knowledge, and then how do we curate and construct a classroom community, and what are the sorts of values that drive our practice of Asian American Studies at CUNY today. So thank you all for your responses. I want to move a little bit to like outside the classroom. So how does some of you already started to share a little bit, and I wanted to hear more about how you see Asian American Studies as transcending the classroom. So if you have any examples of ways that engaging in Asian American Studies has informed you or your students, how you relate to social change work, however you want to define that term. If you have some stories you can share, we would really love to hear them. And I think we could go in the same order, or if anyone has like a desire to start, can leave it open for a moment. Okay, let's go in the same order for simplicity. Anita, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So I regularly partner with community organizations in New York City as well as local writers to arrange readings, guest lectures, and workshops for students. For example, my colleagues and I co-facilitated with the Asian American Federation workshops on mental health. And, it was really important to create spaces for students to discuss violence in our communities. And this also relates to something that Carolyn said earlier, but this whole, all of our students are dealing with the increase in violence in New York City, right? So we did a workshop with Asian American Federation that talked about like safety and, what's the support and safety look like for all of our students, and created like small groups to have students sort of share stories and engage. I've also invited representatives from other community organizations, including Jihadi Sisters, the gender justice organization, DRUM, which deals with immigrant and labor rights, to discuss how AAPI community members have been impacted through health issues, economically, socially by COVID-19. And just to make students aware of their work, right? Like our students can definitely benefit from their work as well. And these are community resources for students. First generation students are also learning about possible careers by meeting, these folks. So there are a lot of ways that this engagement benefits students. For me, supporting and being connected to API organizations and modeling this for students is extremely important. As an Indo-Caribbean scholar and community member who grew up in a single mother working class immigrant home, volunteering for being connected to these organizations in New York City is integral to my identity. It allows me to keep at the fore the impact of this work in the classroom and beyond. And for my students, these connections are powerful ways for them to understand the real world implications of the texts and ideas we discuss in the classroom, including Asian American activism and movements, and to learn how they themselves can contribute to social change in whatever area that they're interested in. And for Asian American students in particular, many of whom come from working class or immigrant backgrounds at LaGuardia, many of them are first generation, these interactions can be transformative in terms of identity formation, having a sense of belonging, raising visibility, and then having opportunities to engage with cultural and political communities and communities in other ways as well. So yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Asian American Studies was always intended to transcend the classroom, right? I feel like if our work isn't directing our students toward communities, toward the streets, we're probably doing it wrong. But I will just say, specifically in the Queens College context, that Asian American Studies is in a real transitional moment in our campus. It's been sort of, let's say, under-resourced in lots of ways for a long time, but there's a movement now to hopefully sort of revive some of these efforts and push our admin to put their money where their mouth is, and to help us sort of hire folks and get things going in a really meaningful way. But what I will say, one thing I really appreciate about doing this work at Queens College in particular is that the history of Asian American Studies on our campus has always been community oriented, has always been thinking both with and beyond the classroom. And I think that is really a great model for this kind of work, especially at CUNY. But I think similar to what Anita was saying about some of her classes and her work with her students, like I would say in my classes, a lot of this sort of thinking and moving beyond the classroom happens kind of organically. I think for most of our students, there isn't this clear line that divides the work they do at school and then the rest of their lives, right? And so they're always already bringing all of that stuff into the classroom and then forcing us to look beyond and outside, right? But I will say, like a lot of the histories and texts that I teach in my Asian American Lit classes in particular, I think students find really eye-opening and impactful. For a lot of them, they're encountering these histories and stories for the first time, or know these histories and stories in really personal ways and have never seen them represented or talked about in the classroom. And so they do often, I think, it just kind of organically get inspired and motivated to want to then do something, to take some action or to get involved or to learn more after they've done reading, right? So whether it's like Carlos Bulassan's America's in the Heart and thinking about labor movements, or Nina Revor's Southland, or more recently, I've taught, text comics like Kiku Hughes's Displacement or Mike Kurata's Flamer that gets students really like excited and wanting to do something with what they're studying. And so we're always in my classes too, I think, like all of us, probably making connections. We're collectively making connections between what we're reading and what's happening in their lives and their communities, and also how these historical struggles are not past, right? That they are ongoing. And then we talk a lot, I try to connect students and talk about community orgs that are engaged in those fights now and what those struggles look like in the current moment, excuse me. And then one other thing I'll mention is that in English at Queens College, and this is probably true of the other CUNYs too, we educate and train a lot of teachers. Excuse me. And I often hear back from my students about how they're sort of like applying stuff they've learned in my Asian American Studies classes. So they're incorporating Asian American Studies content, pedagogies into their high school, middle school, and even elementary school classrooms. And so even though, I think that's another important way that our work, our teaching has that ripple effect and can affect change beyond just our classrooms, maybe many other classrooms. And then it sort of like continues to reverberate throughout various educational institutions and contexts.
Thanks. I feel like also very overwhelmed by this question, and that there are so many layers to it. I was thinking, yes, in terms of like, just by virtue of existing, this feels like social change work, like Asian American Studies is giving voice to communities that historically continue to be marginalized. And I think about the opportunity for students to be centering themselves in this classroom, that there are so many Asian American students that are participants in it as experts. Like, these students have never really had their history, their lived experience being just naturally, intuitively the material of the course. And this is just like oftentimes so thrilling for folks, feeling like, I don't have to like read about this. I just know what's stressful about being an immigrant and carrying the different stereotypes of what that means. So I think in some ways, on an individual participant level, there's that piece. I think also about this social change work being around giving a context in history to see oneself, whether they identify as being Asian American or not, in the larger context of white supremacy and the racial politics of this country. So recognizing, okay, what's this story, and how does this fit in with how institutionalized oppression has worked in this country? How does this voice, this is one other complicating and often kind of generalized part of the story, and that we need like a little bit more specificity to. And I think Asian American Studies really like gives voice to that angle that oftentimes just is kind of flattened out. I also think about our stories in New York City being really specific in that many of you have mentioned, like, we're in the kind of hot seat or hotbed of like many diasporic migration histories, and many different, some folks being fourth generation Asian Americans, many people being super new immigrants here in the city. And there is something that's happening in this community that's alive. And so when I think about transcending the classroom, I'm thinking, how can we have students know that whatever is going on in their daily lives, this is the content. This is the stuff that we're trying to, that needs to be known beyond, this one classroom that they're in. And then another thought I'm having around is just like around mental health in the classroom, and how can that also transcend beyond what we're doing pedagogically. The idea of like the classroom being a place of care as well as a place of giving voice, and that then being that voice being able to legitimize policy, or to go out in the world and use these stories to change the world. I think that's what we hope these trajectories kind of lead to. At least and that's how I kind of am hoping in bringing in empirical research about South Asian American elders in the city? How can people use that knowledge then to go off into the world and try to impact change that benefits these communities that can center where they're coming from?
Yeah, so I wanted to start actually by just acknowledging that for our students, I think at BMCC and probably at a lot of, at least the community college, that the classroom is probably the time that they spend the least amount in, like the classroom in college. One of the ways that I wanted to approach this question was, I think kind of going, I forgot who said it, kind of questioning this divide between the classroom and the community. When I've talked to my students who are they're all commuter students, I feel like the time that they spend at BMCC is so little, and so the time that they spend elsewhere with this knowledge actually is the bulk of their life. So I think this divide between the community and classroom, I think, kind of assumes that there's like a student who spends most of their time either in the classroom or thinking about their schooling or doing homework, and the kind of ideal student that's very rooted, I think, in like race and class dynamics. So I think for our students, as other folks have said, I think they do take the information that they've gotten from our classrooms and just move, through their communities and their workplaces with it. As far as in the classroom, to, I guess, bridge that divide, if there is one, I also teach about social movements, bring in guest speakers, constantly try to tell people if we're studying something. I think other folks have mentioned that there are these community organizations, right, that we can look at who are doing this kind of work. So kind of bringing a little bit of praxis into the classroom, I think. But at the same time, I remember once asking students, how many of you have been to a protest, or how many of you, have participated in a community organization? And the number was very small, and the answer that I got was really around time, right? They're well, I'm working full time and taking classes full time. And so I think that kind of challenges us as professors, as instructors, to take account of the specificity of our students and think about this divide differently. I did want to answer the second part of this question about how Asian American Studies has informed my own relationship. I'll try to be very brief about this, but I was thinking about involvement that I had in a city council campaign for my neighborhood, which part of it's District 25 in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, which is often called the most diverse neighborhood in New York City. And that's great. But it's a very working class and poor neighborhood too, of people from Asia, people from Latin America, and other folks. And one of the things I've thought about a lot through my academic career as a South Asian Americanist in particular is just the hegemony of the 1965 immigration frame. And I think I've always questioned that in my own work, looking at domestic workers, working class activism, but really participating in this city council campaign. The candidate didn't win, but nonetheless, that really showed for me how we need to, as Asian Americanists, I think in general, we need to kind of dislodge the primacy of the 1965 kind of migration. And for me, it was made really clear engaging communities like a growing Burmese community, a small Thai community, a working class and poor Bangladeshi community. And so I do think, even though I'm arguing against something that's so central in one area of Asian American studies, that kind of being able to see some of the critiques that I was developing actually in play really helped me and my engagement and work in that campaign.
So I was thinking about this question. It reminded me of this moment about 8 years ago when I was in the classroom and was talking about my work, and a student asked, "But what do you do, right, outside of that? Do you do anything else? Do you do things in the community?" And I thought that was it, and it kind of struck me because I was raised by ethnic studies. My bachelor's and master's degrees are in ethnic studies, and I kind of lost that along the way, right? But I think this goes back to the point that many of us have already made, that our students are already very engaged in their respective communities, whatever those communities might be. So they will ask us and they will inspire us and also challenge us. And so in that vein, I have since gotten very involved in my community in various ways, whether it's through education or I think one of the bigger lifts that I started doing the last couple of years is I now sit on my county's Asian American Advisory Board, right? So thinking more broadly about the diversity of issues that affect not just students, right, but also the elderly, you know, the recent immigrant, the not so recent, the adoptees, right? I think that's something we often forget, is that there are these Asian identifying adoptees too, and where they might fit within kind of our canon of Asian American studies. And so I think, you know, folks have already here, you know, shared the various ways in which our students engage with social change. But I think the kind of most basic way that this talking about Asian American studies or just experiences of Asian Americans in general, the most basic way I've seen it produce change is just conversation. Right? Just students to keep thinking about the lessons, to keep thinking about the intersections, to keep thinking about the diversity of the Asian diaspora. I thought it was, I mean, this was so telling. I had this student who shared with me that she wanted to learn more about her Chinese grandparents, and this is a Jamaican student, right? This is after we had just kind of talked about the diaspora, and they had never relayed that they had a Chinese grandfather, I believe. And so just having these conversations and thinking broadly, right, about what are these larger systems of oppression? What is colonialism? How are we then ascribed, you know, certain identities, right? And how do we then assert and learn more? And really live in this, I think Marcia said this vibrancy of New York City, right? This like vibrancy of change and history. Like, how do we really think about our belonging in those spaces? I think that is the most basic tenet of social change.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because we're almost out of time for this roundtable, I'm going to ask you all to just close out our session with just one sentence in response to this last question. And originally the question was, you know, what are some of your hopes or visions for the future of Asian American studies? And I think that could be its own roundtable discussion. So in the limited time we have now, maybe you could just share like one thing that's giving you hope right now, one thing that's giving you hope for the future of Asian American studies in one sentence, maybe two, and we'll popcorn this one. So if someone wants to start and then pass it to the next person, we can close out that way. So one thing that's currently giving you hope about the future of Asian American studies. I feel like in your conversation, you've shared so many things that are giving me hope, but if there's something you didn't get a chance to say.
I'm just going to start since no one's chiming in. I want to say all the collaborations of faculty and staff and students across CUNY that keeps nurturing and encouraging me. And this is a great example of one of those spaces, right? When we're not getting a lot of institutional resources and support, and we're really passionate and really understand the importance of this work, having colleagues and community members outside of CUNY who support and encourage and build together is wonderful and hopeful.
You can pass it on to someone, Anita.
Marcia.
Thank you. I was going to say in my classroom, I have been doing a lot more group work this semester, and the students working in groups, it's just such a vibrant conversation in each of their groups. They're coming up with a research study, and they're really curious, and they're really, it seems, invested in learning more. And I think a lot of times we also don't talk to how thrilled students are to be in the classroom and to be learning. They really they value this education very much. And that makes me feel grateful and hopeful. I'll pass it to Diana.
Thank you. I think back, paralleling what both Anita and Marcia said already, just the student interest, and not just interest, but commitment, right? Into learning more about kind of holistic US history and holistic US experiences, and recognizing that what they've been taught are, just a slice, right? That there's so much more. And so I'm very hopeful for this next generation and their curiosity. So I will popcorn to Linta.
Thanks. Yeah, I think kind of following along with what folks are saying, I think I've just seen like different spaces of Asian American and Asian diaspora studies open up, and they can look so different from, a very kind of academic, narrow approach, which I don't mind that approach either, but I like that there's like a diversity of approaches and spaces that really seem to be forming. And I think that's what we need for the field to grow. Sorry, Caroline, but you're the last speaker too.
Oh no, I don't want to have the last word. I mean, I'll just say that I think it's been a really heartbreaking time to do this work. So for me, I mean, everything that everyone has already said, but for me, the things that sustain me, that give me the most hope are is connection. It's shared joy, shared pleasure, shared laughter. Those are the things that keep me going.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for participating in this conversation. I really look forward to continuing these conversations offline and other forums in the future.